Welcome to All Workforce Matters. I'm Teresa Miele, your host. I have Lieutenant Kevin Gino with me from the Rutland County Sheriff's Department. You are the Highway Safety Coordinator, correct?
That's correct.
And we're going to be talking about distracted driving and the workplace today.
That's good.
So I had the opportunity to hear you at our Rotary Club meeting, Rutland South Rotary Club meeting a couple of weeks ago. Very impressed with what you had to offer. And I confess that it has caused me to really think about paying attention differently when I'm driving. So I thank you for that, and I'm sure the people on the road are thanking you for that as well.
Well, thank you. I mean,
You're
it's
welcome.
important that people pick up on some tips when they're out there, that's for sure.
Well, very practical advice. So we had a conversation and said, how does this apply to the workplace? And in my research, I found that according to the National Safety Council, you are 4 times as likely to crash while using a cell phone while driving. And then employers are even being held liable up to $25 million for employee crashes, even when employees are using hands-free devices. So I'm leading in with that, and I'm going to allow you to jump in and talk about some of the things that you have learned, and you're going to share your knowledge with us.
Thank you. Distracted driving is becoming a very big problem in the United States. I think what's happening is cell phones are becoming an addiction. People think it's all right to answer the phone or, push out a text while they're driving or an email. This is all distraction, and it really is underreported in crashes. Because of the technology that's out there, it's sometimes difficult for law enforcement to capture what was going on in that vehicle prior to a crash. We are working on some instruments. They're in the testing phase right now, so that we would be able to tell if that phone was in use prior to the crash. I think some of the things that we see out there, even the hands-free devices, are still a distraction. And as I tell people, there are distractions all over your vehicle. And when I start looking and telling, I say, what about your heater? What about your air conditioning? What about your windshield wipers? What about the radio? What about your power windows? What about the passengers in your vehicle? And you start adding up all these distractions, and we can see where it gets to 94% of the crashes in the United States are human error.
Wow.
And that's a high number. So if we were to subtract 94% of human error, we'd be left with 6% out there that were caused by a faulty vehicle or something that couldn't be controlled by the operator. So
well, one of the things that I remember you talking about is way back when you and I were younger and first learning to drive, and what the vehicles were like then as compared to now.
Right.
That was really kind of eye-opening for me, because I don't think we think about the simplicity of the vehicle way back when as compared to all of the technology that you're describing now.
We have so much technology in the vehicle that it has become a distraction, and that's the problem. We talk about, let's say your heater and defroster and air conditioning control. Back when you and I started driving, that was maybe 3 switches, maybe 4. But now it's like 10 or 12, because there's different, you got automation, you can set your temperature, you can do this, defroster's another button. I mean, all of these things are distractions, especially when you have to search for them while you're driving. And, I think that can happen to anybody, when they're driving a vehicle and all of a sudden the windshield fogs up, and now we've got to find that defroster button with the little defroster on it, So
I know better now, but some people might say, so what's the big deal, Kevin? I'm just reaching over there for a second. I just moved my arm to the right, or I just reached over to the seat for a second. I knew what I was doing. It was only a couple of seconds. Why are you making such a big deal about this? Yeah, there are crashes out there, 94%, but that's not me. I have control over this.
That's not me today. It could be you at any moment. So when you talk about distraction, and let's talk about moving something to the right of your vehicle. What is your tendency when you take and reach for something to your right, your tendency is to move that vehicle to the left, or steering wheel to the left. It happens more times than not. What's your tendency when something happens to your left is to take that steering wheel to the right. You know, maybe go off the shoulder and catch yourself. You know, that's what rumble strips are made for all over the United States now. Those things are kind of like a warning. It's like drowsy driving, okay? Drowsy driving probably happens more in the winter time than it does during the summer and the fall. But in the winter time, you just work the double shift. Let's say you work from 11 at night to 3 in the afternoon, 16 hours. Now you've got maybe a half an hour, 45-minute drive home. You only had 6 hours of sleep the night before. Now in your way there, you're starting to drowse out, so you roll the window down, you put it back up. The thing to do, though, is pull over and take a power nap. That usually solves the problem. Power nap is not 5 minutes. I'm talking about 30 or 45 minutes. In Rutland County, since October of 16 till now, we've had 3 fatalities, drowsy driving. Wow. You know, and one of our sergeant's wife had a very close call down on Route 7 a few weeks ago with a drowsy driver. He'd gone to work early in the morning, the drowsy driver, like 3 in the morning. He's coming back at 3 or 4 in the afternoon. He just falls asleep and comes into her lane of travel. It's a problem. And, you know, we're trying to educate people on it. It is a ticketable offense to leave your lane, you know, because there's a section roadways lane for traffic, but you know, we're finding that if we find these people out there and we're getting reports on them, and if we stop them and they're drowsy, we'll say, hey, you've got the choice. Take a power nap, 45 minutes, or I'm going to ticket you here for whatever offense has occurred. You know, it's not worth somebody's life, you know.
Very true. You know? Very serious consequences.
And we've all been in that situation where you're really, really tired and you're driving and you're trying to make a destination, but you have to realize at some point, you know, when you can't keep your eyes open, you have to pull over.
Time to pull over and
Time
stop.
to pull over and stop.
So when we think about distracted driving and texting and cell phones, we typically hear about teenagers.
Not true.
So they don't have the corner on this market.
They don't. It's adults up to our age. In fact, there's probably more people being ticketed at our age between, you know, 30 and 60 than it is the young kids that are out there. So I'm not saying they don't do it, because they do it. But, you know, we're seeing extremes to the texting now. They're no longer up on the steering wheel. They're down in their lap, and they're texting down in their lap. So that's an avoidance, so law enforcement can't see them. So what have we done? We've had to put spotters out there, you know, that can actually see in the vehicles. We had a situation in Brandon where the chief up there was getting complaints about cell phones in the work zones. So he actually went to the 3rd floor of the town offices and was calling them out one after the other in a work zone where people were texting or on their cell phone, which is a heavier violation. And we got a number of commercial vehicles through there, 18-wheelers that were on their cell phone or texting. You know, not something you should be doing, but really not something you should be doing in a work zone. I mean, the emphasis here is, what about the safety of those people in that work zone?
Right.
You know, their life depends on your behavior, driving behavior. So, I mean, is it worth it? No. But it's all this instant gratification thing, you know. And employers are sometimes guilty of, they will call the employee or they will text the employee. You know, and employers will say to me, well, what was I supposed to do? Well, what did you do before cell phones? Well, I know where the employee was going to stop on a route or whatever, and I'd call that store or business and tell him to call me. Well, maybe that's a better way to do it. You know, I realize that's kind of antiquated, but is it better than putting that employee at risk by answering the phone or doing a text?
Believe it or not, you just reminded me that a little over a year ago, I was visiting family in Baltimore and had an accident. I had a driver run into me, was not paying attention, and it was because his employer, his supervisor, called him on the phone. He reached for the phone to answer the phone, didn't stay in his lane, and realized that we were all bearing to the left, and he drove right into me. And he said his employer does it to him regularly. And I said, well, it sounds like you need to have a conversation and say, I'm not going to answer the phone, because he was concerned about not being responsive and it becoming a performance issue for him.
And that shouldn't be tied in with a performance issue.
Absolutely
I mean,
not.
this is a safety thing, you know.
Yes.
So I mean, you need to find some better way of communicating with that employee than a cell phone or a text. And you wouldn't ask your employee to drive 90 miles an hour to get to another location because they really need that delivery, right? So why would you ask that employee to answer a phone or a text? I mean, it's just a point of what people's expectations are. And then again, we go back to the addiction of the cell phone, and we go back to that instantaneous, I need an answer right now. Instead of, I can't wait 15 minutes. You know, it's really that type of thing.
From what I'm reading, in terms of safety culture, because it goes back to the safety culture of the company and wanting to make sure that your employees are safe inside of and outside of the company. And that really best practice is not allowing any cell phone use at all, so that the employer's policy is very specific. And at the end of our show today, we will have a video clip speaking to that from the National Safety Council. But I think that this is something that very much needs to be revisited by employers, so that they're not putting themselves at risk in terms of employee injury or injuring other people on the road.
Well, I find employers have these policies, but in reality, the employer will violate the policy to get a hold of the employee. And you know, again, why have a policy if you're going to violate it?
Right.
You know, it's like having a waiver that's no good. I mean, it's really common sense on the part of the employer.
Yes.
Now, I'm not
They
going
need
to
to
say
set the
all
example.
employers, but you know, we're going to get back to the, you know, what should you do and what shouldn't you do. I mean, and that's the case there. It's just, there are so many things that, when I grew up, you know, one of the famous sayings my father had, and he operated a commercial business, you know, that had commercial vehicles. And one of the famous sayings my father had, driving is a full-time job. You don't do anything else. Driving, and he's right, driving is a full-time job. And the older you get, the harder it gets. It just becomes that way. Because, you know, when you're young, you think you know it all. You're invincible. You can drive anything. You can drive, you know, all that stuff that we learn is not true. But as we get older, we all of a sudden slow down to a pace that's comfortable to us, and we go, hey, you know, what is safe and what is unsafe, you know?
So you go into schools, I know we're talking about the workplace, but you go into schools and talk with students about driving, distracted driving. Talk a little bit about that. I found that really fascinating.
Well, I go into the area schools, usually trying to catch them at the permit stage, or usually 1 year after they've had their license. And we talk about the different things that young drivers do. There's, you know, young drivers will, you know, probably 50% of young drivers between 16 and 20 will be involved in a crash, whether it be minor, backing into a pole, or it could be a major crash. Some of the spikes we're seeing is that young drivers are getting into more crashes. So what I go in and trying to explain to them, okay, what's the average distraction? You know, we know the average distraction. They put it out there, AAA, I think, puts it like 27 seconds, which, you know, when I tell people, they're like, no, it can't be. And I'm like, yeah, it can be. Think about how long a phone call lasts. Does it last 27 seconds? How long does a text last? Well, you text the person back, then they text you, and then you text them back. Think about that. So then I use the mathematics of 30 miles an hour. I compare it to a location near the school and tell them how many feet have you traveled in a distracted mode. So they'll begin to get the light bulb there. And then what we do is we'll do another test with them. I will give them a text to put into their phone, and a teacher will call out a sequence of numbers, not in order, and their job is to get both, get the text and get the numbers. And they can never get both. I've had a few, but not many that could get both within that 45-second frame. They weren't able to get both. It tells them, that doing two things at once, or trying to multitask behind the wheel is not something you want to do. And, it's something none of us should do, It's, and you talk about these things, I hear people walking down the streets with their cell phones. Sometimes they're screaming into their phones. Thinking to myself, talk about emotional behavior in the public. They're screaming at the other person. And I'm thinking to myself, what if you were in a car? And I've seen it in a car too, where, they go by and it's like, it's not legal. I mean, but, you're in an emotional state, you're driving a car, plus you're on a cell phone. Think about that.
Pretty scary.
This is a recipe for a crash waiting to happen, And the things that people think are okay are not okay. It's just like wearing seatbelts. You get that person out there, well, we just got through the Click It or Ticket campaign, and I stopped a guy with a brand new GMC pickup. I mean, this thing was beautiful. It was loaded. And he doesn't have his seatbelt on. And I'm like, how can you do that? Doesn't the buzzer drive you crazy? He goes, no, it shuts off after a while. And I'm like,
ooh,
why would you do that? Why would you want to do that? And we know this year, I believe we had like 23 fatal accidents in the state of Vermont so far this year. And we know at least 50% or better of those were not belted, Well, think about that. That's 11, 12 people that would still be alive if they'd worn their seatbelt, And there's another workplace thing that, we got a policy, our company says you must wear their seatbelt. But then they see them not wearing their seatbelt, and they tell them, well, don't let me catch you again. Well, there should be a harsher penalty for not wearing your seatbelt.
Very serious consequence for that.
Because you're not going to live if you're ejected from the vehicle. I tell people that all the time. And then you got some old timers out there that tell me about how the steering wheel rod used to come up through and puncture the seat, and how, yes, that was in the 1950s and the 1960s, but our cars are built today to collapse. We got airbags, we got all sorts of safety things in them to help us now. Seatbelt, airbag, pretty much if you stay within that car, unless it's a horrific crash, you're probably going to survive, Might have some injuries, but, you're probably going to survive. And the bottom line is, you don't follow those rules. People don't think about what happens in a crash. You have the crash. Let's say it's a head-on crash, but then what happens to the vehicle? Does the vehicle go into a motion? Does it go into a sideways motion? Your body's going that way. It's going that way, it's going this way, or it's going through the windshield. And people just don't get that. It irritates me, as you can tell.
I can tell.
It irritates me.
Well, I think that it does, likely because you see the result of really poor decision making that could have been prevented, which is why you're doing the work that you're doing.
When you talk about 11 or 12 people in the state of Vermont that could have lived, think of how many families have been affected by the simple decision not to wear a seatbelt. I mean, think about that. You're talking about parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, maybe brothers, sisters, and the list just goes on and on. What reason do you have for not wearing your seatbelt?
I'll extend it beyond that to the workplace and the community, because those people will seriously grieve that loss as well. So when we think about not putting on that seatbelt, or we think about choosing to text, or to reach over and grab something, or not really make driving your full-time job, as your dad said, we're really making a decision that impacts a lot of different people. It's really, sometimes I think what we hear is, well, it's my choice. It's only, I get to pick this. And what people aren't realizing is that they also are choosing this for all of the people around them, whether or not they're in the car with them, because of the impact to so many lives.
Right, and I think sometimes I'll stop people, driver will be belted, but there'll be somebody in the car that's not belted, and I'll go, that's a ticketable offense. You were stopped for speeding, and that person's not seat belted in the back seat. It's like, well, I didn't know that. What do you mean you didn't know that? Everybody in your car is supposed to be buckled up, you know? I mean, it's common sense, and, you know, I'm going to shift gears a little bit on you here, but we're getting towards the holiday, and we know that, you know, employers tend to have family barbecues or workplace barbecues, you know, have the workplace over, and maybe we'll buy a couple of cases of beer, or maybe we'll do it on Friday night because we're going to take a 4-day weekend. Well, that employer is responsible if that employee on the way home gets into a crash because he or she is intoxicated. That can become a workman's comp issue.
That's absolutely true.
You know, that can become a total workman's comp issue, and you don't know how many companies do that.
And don't realize.
And don't realize
that it is their liability.
That is their liability riding on that person's vehicle as they ride out of there and go home, because they are returning from the workplace, and you have supplied the booze. And if it's on your workplace, I don't care whether you've supplied the booze or not, if they brought it with them, it's still on your dime, you know? So.
And on your dime is a very key point, because this was just highlighted at the Law Summit that Ryan Smith and Carbine presented for human resources professionals earlier this year. And if, you know, there are variables that come around this, but the bottom line is, if employees are there, whether they're purchasing the alcohol or adult beverage or not, the employer can still be held liable for that. So it doesn't have to be at the place of work. There are other conditions and responsibilities that fall into that. So it's a bigger issue, I think, that employers have not had a chance to really, at least some employers have not had a chance to really think through. But the bottom line is, if you go back to a safety culture, you want all of your people to be safe.
Well, you want them to be safe coming to work and going home
Absolutely.
from work. And
absolutely.
When maybe you invite your employees to go out to the local watering hole, you know, and they go to the local watering hole, and you buy a round of drinks or you don't buy a round of drinks. Doesn't make any difference. You're putting your company in jeopardy for whatever situation these people are getting themselves into.
Absolutely.
You know, and I've heard employers say, well, I didn't force them to drink. Well, no. But you're no better than the person that's sitting there at the bar, watches a guy stagger up to his car, stick the key in the door and open and get behind the wheel. You think somebody should call? Yes. Do you think somebody does all the time? No.
So what prevents people from calling? I remember this coming up, and I actually asked the question. So what happens if Teresa calls and reports that member of our community who is staggering out and wants to prevent them from driving?
You make a call to 911 and simply say, you know, if you are a good citizen and you want to give a statement, great. You know, we've had people follow drunk drivers for over 20 miles and stay on the phone with 911 and say, you know, we're here, this is what's happening. You know, I once had a DUI that came from White River Junction, 89, all the way to Rutland, Vermont. Guy was hammered. He was from Massachusetts.
Oh my goodness.
Bottom line, I picked up 5 statements on that case, 5 different statements. The guy was all over the road. But if you don't want to give your name, fine. Drop the dime, save somebody. You know, the thing that when I go into schools and I talk to kids, I talk about having the courage. What would you do if your best friend and you were at a party and your best friend was intoxicated and ready to leave and will not give you the keys to the car? And they're like, they sit there sometimes, and I'm like, would you try to take the keys away from him? Some of them would. What if he was disorderly? What would you do then? I don't know. I don't want to be a rat. Really? I've heard this before. Okay, this is where courage comes in. Will you want to be a rat tomorrow morning when you just killed a family of 5? he or she killed a family of 5. Do you want to be a rat? Is that what it's all about? Stop it. We're in a whole different society today. You know, that's not approved. You know, no longer can you allow the guy to get drunk, get behind the wheel. He makes it home every night because he knows the same path. You know, put one obstacle in his path, and he or she will crash. Definitely, I tell you. But you know, it's really. I'm amazed at the number of reports we get every day, and not all of them turn out to be drunk drivers. Some of them turn out to be drowsy drivers. But we get a number of reports every day of, you know, people driving DUI, and usually they are DUI. We had a guy recently, a husband and wife followed a car from Manchester, Vermont. One of our deputies stopped that car in South Wallingford. And a guy had come from like way down in the Bronx in New York.
Oh my goodness.
And was definitely DUI. And you know, it's amazing. It's amazing.
I think what we're saying is that instead of looking at it like ratting people out, that it really is about taking that step of taking care of members of our community who are driving either distracted or drunk driving, whatever it might be, not putting their seatbelt on, that it really is up to us as a community to step up and make sure we're doing the job to keep ourselves and members of our community safe.
Yes,
and to make that call.
Absolutely. I mean, there's no reason not to make that call. And even if you don't want to give your name, you can say, I don't want to get involved, but Vermont registration, the guy just came out of a bar, he appears to be intoxicated, or I saw him drinking enough, click. It's enough for at least us to get the BOL out for the vehicle and at least maybe attempt to stop that person from causing a crash. And that's important.
And that's what we need to do to model that for our children.
Yes.
So that we are doing everything that we can as community members and as parents and adults so that our children are following in our footsteps in a positive way and not seeing us texting and not calling up and reporting.
And you wouldn't believe the number of people or kids that I get in class that say, yeah, mom or dad texts or answers the phone all the time while I'm in the car. It's like, please, no.
Yeah,
Good. Not good modeling behavior.
Absolutely.
You know, so.
Well, I'm noticing that our time is dwindling down. I can't believe it went so fast.
It went very fast.
Very fast. So what I'm going to encourage our viewing audience to do is to take steps to keep people safe and report when you see it. No texting, no distracted driving. And I'm going to leave you with a video clip from the National Safety Council. And remember, all workforce matters. Let's be safe out there.
If a company is going to have a definitive impact and if they're going to keep their workforce safe, they really need to put a total cell phone ban policy in place. And by total, I mean no handheld, no hands-free. It needs to apply to all drivers, all employees, not just a certain segment. One of the simplest policies I've seen is from a major Fortune 50 company in the United States that says you cannot use a cell phone as an employee of this company while driving, handheld or hands-free, for any reason, if any of the following 5 conditions exist. Number 1, if you're driving a company car. Number 2, if you're driving a personal car but on company business. Number 3, if you're on company property, driving on company property. Number 4, if you're using a company supplied phone. And number 5, if you're using your own phone but you're using it for company business. In any of those cases, no cell phone use. The vast majority, I'm talking 95% of companies that have put these policies into place tell us they've seen no reduction in productivity. It makes sense to think there'd be a loss in productivity, but what we're finding out in the real world is that's not the case. We aren't sure exactly why. We're trying to find out more, but I think people adapt. I know when I stopped using a cell phone, I pull over on rest areas more frequently than I used to. I check to see if I have any important calls. At the end of the day, I don't notice that. My trip maybe took a few minutes longer, but at the end of the day, I don't notice that. I also think a lot of the calls that we think are just critical and we couldn't live without them, there aren't really that many. The vast majority of the calls, I think, we're passing time because, unfortunately, about 98% of the time driving is a very uneventful thing. It's that 2% of the time where our life depends upon making the right decision that it's critical, and we've got to be fully engaged in the task of driving.